Behind the glittering facade of royal ceremonies and diplomatic smiles, Princess Diana was quietly watching, listening, and forming opinions no one was ever meant to hear about the most powerful political figures in Britain. And what she thought could have shaken the entire establishment. She was never meant to be a witness in that way. Not truly. The world saw her as warmth, as vulnerability, as a symbol of grace moving through carefully choreographed moments. But beneath that softness lived a mind that noticed everything. The pauses between words, the way a smile would tighten just slightly when cameras turned away, the difference between what was said and what was meant. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Power revealed itself to her in fragments. Not in speeches or official statements, but in quieter places, rooms where conversations softened, but meanings sharpened. There were meetings that left no record, exchanges that lived only in memory. It was there, in that unguarded space between formality and truth, that Diana began to understand the people shaping the nation's direction. And she did not simply observe, she interpreted. Each prime minister who crossed her path carried a presence that extended beyond policy. Some filled a room with controlled authority. Others masked uncertainty behind practiced confidence. Diana felt those differences instantly. Where others saw leaders, she saw individuals, measured not by position, but by how they made others feel when power was no longer being performed. She began to build a quiet archive, not written, not always spoken, but held carefully within her. Impressions, reactions, moments that didn't align with public perception, a glance that lingered too long, a tone that carried something colder beneath its surface. These were the details she trusted more than any speech. Outwardly, she remained exactly what she was expected to be: gracious, attentive, composed. The perfect listener. But inwardly, a second reality was forming. One where politeness did not equal respect, where charm did not guarantee sincerity, where leadership, stripped of its presentation, often revealed something far more complicated and far less comforting. What unsettled her most was how quickly she could see through it, the performances, the careful construction of image. It became clear to her that power depended on perception, and that once you understood that, the illusion became impossible to ignore. And yet, she said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood what it would mean if she did. Some of her thoughts were sharp, unforgiving, not shaped for public ears. They carried a truth that didn't fit within palace walls or political narratives. And perhaps that was why they remained hidden. Because once spoken, they could not be contained. But before her voice grew confident and sharp, there was a time when Diana was still learning the rules of power, and her first encounters with Britain's leadership would quietly shape everything that followed. At just 20 years old, Diana entered a world where every word mattered, and every silence meant something more. Her early meetings with Britain's most powerful leaders revealed a truth she wasn't prepared for. Power wasn't warm, and it certainly wasn't kind. She arrived with a kind of openness that hadn't yet been shaped by caution. There was curiosity in her, and a quiet willingness to believe that those in charge carried not just authority, but understanding. At first, the presence of prime ministers felt almost surreal. Figures she had only known from distance now speaking directly, acknowledging her, measuring her. It was a moment that could have inspired confidence. Instead, it left her unsettled in ways she couldn't immediately explain. Because what struck her wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. There was a stillness in those conversations, but not the comforting kind. It was calculated, controlled. Words were chosen carefully, but emotions were kept far away, as if feeling itself had no place in leadership. Diana sensed it instantly, that invisible wall between power and humanity. And the more she stood within it, the more she realized how alone it made her feel. At first, she tried to adapt. She listened closely. She mirrored the tone, the restraint, the discipline of those around her. But something inside her resisted. She wasn't built to detach. She didn't just hear people, she felt them. And what she felt in those early encounters was distance, not just from herself, but from the lives these decisions would ultimately affect. She began to notice patterns. Public voices carried certainty, strength, even reassurance. But in private, something shifted. There were hesitations, subtle contradictions. A different kind of language, less confident, more guarded. It was in those moments that Diana understood something most never saw. Leadership wasn't always what it claimed to be. And truth didn't always survive behind closed doors. What unsettled her further was the realization that she, too, was being watched, studied, assessed. Every word she spoke carried weight she hadn't yet learned to manage. Every reaction was quietly noted. It wasn't just her observing power. Power was observing her, and it demanded something in return: control, silence, precision. But Diana wasn't thinking in those terms. She wasn't calculating strategy or influence. She was asking simpler, more human questions. Do they care? Do they understand? Do they feel anything beyond the role they play? And too often, the answer she sensed was no. That realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a quiet disappointment settling in. A recognition that this world, this system she had stepped into, operated on a logic that didn't match her own. It valued composure over connection, authority over empathy, and in that imbalance, something essential felt missing. She carried that feeling with her after each encounter. Not anger, not yet. Just a growing awareness that the people guiding the country seemed strangely distant from the people within it. And for someone like Diana, who instinctively moved toward emotion rather than away from it, that distance felt impossible to ignore. And then came a leader, whose presence would leave a lasting impression on Diana, not because of warmth or understanding, but because of a chilling, unspoken tension neither of them could ignore. When Diana encountered Britain's most formidable prime minister, the room didn't just grow quiet, it became charged. Two powerful women, vastly different in worldview, locked in a silent battle of perception. And what Diana felt in those moments would define her distrust of political strength forever. This was not like the others. There was no attempt at warmth, no effort to soften the edges of authority. The presence she faced was deliberate, unwavering, almost immovable. It carried a certainty that didn't ask for understanding. It demanded alignment. And Diana felt it immediately, not as intimidation alone, but as something colder, something that left no space for emotion to exist. Where Diana listened with instinct, this kind of power spoke with precision. Every word had purpose. Every pause had control. There was no hesitation, no vulnerability. And in that absence, Diana sensed something deeply unsettling. Not strength, but distance disguised as strength. A kind of leadership that did not bend, did not question, did not feel. She tried, at first, to meet it halfway, to remain composed, to respond in kind. But the more she stood in that presence, the more aware she became of how different they were. Diana moved through the world by reading people, by sensing their fears, their needs, their unspoken truths. But here, there was nothing offered, no opening. no softness. Only a wall of certainty that refused to acknowledge anything beyond itself. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, something began to shift inside her. There were moments, small, almost invisible, where she felt it. A glance that lingered just long enough to feel like judgment. A tone that suggested she was being measured, not understood. Not as a person, but as a variable. A symbol. Something to be assessed, controlled, perhaps even corrected. And Diana felt the weight of that perception. It unsettled her, not because she doubted herself, but because she recognized what it represented. A world where emotion was seen as weakness, where empathy had no place in decision-making, where being human was something to suppress, not embrace. But Diana was not built that way. And so, while part of her felt the pressure, the quiet force of being in the presence of someone so certain, so unyielding, another part of her resisted. Quietly, steadily. She did not challenge it openly. Not yet. But inside, she began to question everything it stood for. Was this what leadership required? To disconnect? To harden? To remove feeling entirely in order to appear strong? If so, then something about that system felt deeply wrong. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. A slow, growing understanding that power, as she was seeing it, often came at the cost of humanity. And once she saw that, she couldn't unsee it. From that point on, her perception shifted. She no longer viewed strength as something to admire automatically. She began to look beneath it, to question it, to search for what was missing rather than what was presented. And more often than not, what was missing mattered more. That encounter stayed with her, not as a single moment, but as a turning point. A quiet line drawn within her own mind, between authority and compassion, between control and understanding. And on that line, Diana knew exactly where she stood. But not every leader left Diana feeling diminished. Some drew out a completely different side of her, one that revealed just how deeply she longed for connection in a world built on distance. For brief, fleeting moments, Diana believed she had found something rare leaders who didn't just speak to her as a princess, but as a person. But even those moments of connection carried a painful truth she couldn't escape. Not every encounter left her feeling small or distant. There were exceptions, quiet ones, almost fragile in their existence, where the rigid structure of power seemed to loosen, just enough for something human to come through. In those moments, the tone shifted. The language softened. And for the first time, Diana felt seen. Not as a symbol, but as someone real. It didn't take much. A question asked with genuine interest. A pause that wasn't calculated, but thoughtful. A response that acknowledged emotion instead of avoiding it. These were small things, almost invisible to anyone else. But to Diana, they meant everything. Because they broke the pattern. In those conversations, she allowed herself to relax, even if only slightly. The constant awareness, the silent pressure to maintain composure. It faded just enough for her to speak more freely. And when she did, she revealed pieces of herself that were usually kept hidden behind expectation. Her doubts, her confusion, her desire to understand a system that often felt impossible to reach. For a brief time, it felt like balance might exist. That power didn't have to come at the cost of empathy. That leadership could still carry warmth without losing strength. And Diana held on to that possibility carefully, almost cautiously, as if afraid it might disappear the moment she looked at it too closely. But over time, something became clear. Even those who seemed different weren't entirely free. The same people who listened, who appeared to understand, who spoke with a softness others lacked. They still moved within the same boundaries. Their words, no matter how genuine, were still shaped by something larger, a system that demanded control, that limited what could be said, and more importantly, what could be done. And Diana felt that shift. What began as connection slowly revealed its limits. Conversations that once felt open became restrained. Not cold, not distant, but careful. As if there were lines that could not be crossed, truths that could not be fully acknowledged. And in that restraint, Diana recognized something familiar. Not insincerity, but confinement. It created a quiet conflict within her. She wanted to trust those moments, to believe they were real, that they meant something lasting. But another part of her held back, remembering everything she had already seen. The contradictions, the distance, the silence that followed honesty. So she stood between two feelings, hope and caution. And that space became heavier with time. Because the closer she felt to understanding someone, the more painful it became to realize they couldn't fully step outside the role they carried. They could come close. They could almost meet her where she stood. But not completely. And that almost stayed with her. It lingered longer than the conversations themselves. It shaped how she saw every interaction that followed. Because once you've felt something genuine, even briefly, its absence becomes impossible to ignore. And perhaps that was the deepest impact of those moments, not the comfort they gave her, but the contrast they created. A contrast that made every future disappointment sharper, every distance more noticeable, every silence heavier. Because for every moment of warmth Diana experienced, there were others that revealed something far darker, something that made her question whether the system itself was beyond saving. Hidden behind closed doors, away from cameras and protocol, Diana heard things she was never supposed to hear, conversations that exposed the true nature of power. And once she understood what was really being said, she could never look at leadership the same way again. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything became clear. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, voices lowered just enough to suggest secrecy, sentences that stopped halfway, meanings that hung in the air long after the words had ended. Diana found herself present in spaces where the performance dropped, even if only slightly. And in those spaces, the truth began to surface. At first, she wasn't sure what she was hearing. The tone felt different, less polished, more direct. There were discussions that carried a weight she hadn't expected. Decisions framed not in terms of people, but in terms of outcomes, strategies, consequences. It was efficient, controlled, but something about it felt deeply disconnected. And then came the realization that unsettled her most. These conversations weren't abstract. They weren't distant ideas removed from reality. They were choices, real ones, that would ripple outward, shaping lives far beyond those rooms. And yet, the way they were spoken about lacked the emotion she instinctively felt was necessary. There was logic, there was calculation, but there was very little acknowledgement of the human cost. Diana absorbed it quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge. But inside, something shifted. The gap she had sensed before, the distance between power and people, was no longer a feeling. It was something she could hear unmistakably in the way decisions were discussed. There were moments that stayed with her longer than others. A comment delivered casually that carried a heavier meaning beneath it. A choice explained in a way that prioritized control over compassion. A silence that followed a difficult topic, not because it was painful, but because it was inconvenient. These were the details that lingered, and the more she understood, the harder it became to ignore. Because now she knew. She knew how things were decided. She knew what was considered, and what was quietly set aside. And with that knowledge came a weight she couldn't share. Not openly. Not without consequence. The system she had entered wasn't built for voices like hers to disrupt it. It expected alignment. It required discretion. So she carried it alone. That isolation deepened over time. Conversations that once felt confusing now felt revealing. Encounters that once left her uncertain now left her questioning everything. She began to form clearer opinions, stronger ones, not just about individuals, but about the structure itself, about what it valued, about what it ignored. And those thoughts were no longer passive. They were becoming sharper, more defined, more difficult to contain. There was a growing awareness within her that what she had come to understand wasn't harmless. It wasn't neutral. Knowledge, in that environment, came with risk, especially when it belonged to someone who wasn't expected to question it. And perhaps that was the most dangerous shift of all, because Diana was no longer just observing power. She was beginning to see through it. And once that happens, silence becomes harder to maintain. And as her understanding deepened, so did her courage, because Diana was no longer content with simply observing power. She was beginning to challenge it, quietly but unmistakably. There came a point when Diana stopped seeing prime ministers as individuals and started seeing them as pieces of a much larger machine, a machine she no longer trusted. And what she began to believe about that system would put her on a path she could never turn back from. It wasn't a sudden shift. It grew slowly, almost quietly, shaped by everything she had seen, heard, and felt, but could never fully express. At first, her thoughts had been personal, about tone, about behavior, about how each leader made her feel in their presence. But over time, those impressions began to connect. Patterns emerged. And once they did, it became impossible to separate the people from the structure that shaped them. She started to see consistency where she once saw difference. Different faces, different voices, different styles of leadership. And yet, beneath all of it, the same limitations appeared again and again. The same careful language, the same restrained actions, the same invisible boundaries that no one seemed willing or able to cross. It raised a question she could no longer ignore. Were they truly leading, or simply maintaining something much larger than themselves? That question unsettled her more than anything she had experienced before, because it meant that even those who appeared compassionate were still confined, that even those who listened could not always act. That empathy within that system had limits. And those limits weren't personal. They were structural, built into the very foundation of how power operated. Diana felt it with increasing clarity. There were moments when she expected change, when something she had seen or felt demanded a response. But nothing happened. Or worse, something did happen. But it felt distant, diluted, stripped of the urgency she believed it deserved. And in those moments, frustration began to replace confusion. Not loud, not visible, but deep. She found herself questioning not just decisions, but the absence of them, the delays, the silence, the sense that real issues were being managed rather than truly addressed. And for someone who responded to human suffering instinctively, that restraint felt unbearable. But alongside that frustration came something even more difficult: conflict, because she was not outside the system. She was part of it, bound to it, expected to uphold it. Her position required loyalty, composure, and above all, discretion. And yet, Everything she was feeling pushed against those expectations, every instinct she had, every emotional response, every quiet realization moved in the opposite direction. It created a tension she carried constantly. There were moments when it showed, even if only slightly. A hesitation in her response, a carefully chosen word that hinted at something deeper, a shift in tone that suggested she was no longer fully aligned. These were small acts, subtle, easy to overlook, but they were there, and they mattered, because they marked a change. Diana was no longer simply reacting to what she experienced. She was beginning to question it, to evaluate it, to form conclusions that extended beyond individuals and into the system itself. And once that line was crossed, there was no returning to the simplicity of before. She had seen too much, understood too much, and perhaps most importantly, felt too much. That awareness transformed her, not into someone louder, but into someone sharper, more aware of what was being said and what was being avoided, more attuned to the weight of silence, more willing, even if quietly, to push against it. But awareness comes with a cost, because the more clearly she saw the system, the more she realized it was not designed to be questioned, not openly, not from within, and certainly not by someone who was expected to embody its image rather than challenge its reality. And that realization changed how she was seen. Not immediately, not openly, but gradually. Because in a world like that, perception shifts long before anything is spoken aloud. But as Diana's perspective sharpened, so did the risks surrounding her. Because in a world built on silence, even unspoken opinions can become a threat. It wasn't just what Diana knew, it was what she might say. And within the highest levels of power, a quiet fear began to grow. What if the princess, who had seen everything, decided to speak? At first, it was only a shift in atmosphere. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Conversations became slightly more guarded when she entered. Pauses stretched a fraction longer. Words were chosen with greater care, not because she had demanded answers, but because something about her presence had changed. She was no longer just listening. She was understanding. And that made her unpredictable. There was a growing awareness among those who operated within the system that Diana was not following the usual path. She wasn't settling into silence. She wasn't accepting things without question. Her reactions, though often restrained, carried a depth that hinted at something beneath the surface, something that couldn't easily be controlled. She didn't need to say much. A look held for just a moment too long. A response that seemed simple but carried a subtle edge. A shift in tone that suggested she saw more than she was willing to reveal. These were small things. But in a world built on precision, even small deviations stood out. And people noticed. There were whispers, not spoken directly, not openly acknowledged, but present. A sense that Diana was forming her own perspective, separate from what was expected. That she wasn't just absorbing information, but interpreting it. And more importantly, that she might one day choose to share what she had come to understand. That possibility alone was enough to create tension. Because unpredictability, in a system built on control, is a risk. Diana felt it, even if it was never explicitly stated. The way conversations would shift direction. The way certain topics seemed to close just as she approached them. The careful balance between inclusion and distance. It was as if she was being allowed close enough to observe, but not close enough to disrupt. But by then, it was already too late. She had seen enough. And more importantly, she had begun to trust what she saw. That trust isolated her further. It made her cautious, but it also made her stronger. She no longer looked for reassurance in others. She didn't rely on the structure to guide her understanding. Instead, she turned inward, relying on her own instincts, her own interpretations of what was real and what was not. But that came at a cost. The space between her and those around her widened. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be easily pointed out, but enough to be felt. Trust became fragile. Conversations became careful. And silence. Silence became something else entirely. It was no longer just expected. It was necessary, because speaking carried consequences she couldn't fully predict. And yet, remaining silent carried its own weight. It meant holding everything inside, every realization, every doubt, every quiet conclusion she had reached about the people and the system around her. That silence protected her, but it also confined her. It became both shield and prison. And within that tension, something began to build. Not outwardly, not visibly, but steadily. A sense that this balance couldn't last forever. That something, at some point, would have to give. And when it did, the consequences wouldn't be small. They couldn't be. Because in a world that depended on control, even the possibility of truth breaking through was enough to create fear. And yet, despite the pressure, the silence, and the risk, Diana continued to form her own truth, one that would ultimately shape how she saw every leader who crossed her path. By the end, Diana's opinions were no longer forming. They were clear, unshakable, and deeply personal. And when you piece them together, they reveal not just what she thought of power, but what power had done to her. There was no confusion left, no hesitation. What had once been instinctive impressions, shaped by emotion and uncertainty, had hardened into something far more defined. Diana no longer needed time to understand the people she encountered within that world. She had already seen the pattern. And once she recognized it, everything else began to fall into place. Different leaders, different personalities, different approaches, but beneath it all, the same structure, the same limits, the same quiet distance between those who held power and those who lived under it. It wasn't about individuals anymore. It was about what they became once they stepped into that role, and what they became rarely matched what she had hoped for. Diana had once believed that leadership could carry both strength and compassion. That authority didn't have to come at the expense of humanity. But over time, that belief had been tested again and again, until it no longer felt sustainable. Because what she saw, consistently, was a system that demanded control above all else. A system where emotion was filtered, softened, or removed entirely. And that realization changed her. Not outwardly, not in ways that could be easily measured, but internally. It reshaped how she understood everything around her. The conversations she once approached with openness, she now approached with awareness. The warmth she once hoped to find, she no longer expected. And the trust she once offered freely became something far more guarded. There was disappointment in that shift, not dramatic, not explosive, but deep and lasting. Because it wasn't just about what she had seen in others. It was about what those experiences had taken from her. A certain kind of belief, a certain kind of hope. And yet, there was also clarity. Diana wasn't disillusioned in the sense of being lost. She understood more now than she ever had before. She could see through the performance of power with precision. She recognized the patterns, the limitations, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction. And in that understanding, there was a kind of strength. But it came at a cost, because once you see something clearly, you can't return to the comfort of not knowing. And Diana carried that awareness with her. Every time she listened, every time she observed, every time she stood within a system that no longer felt aligned with who she was. Her final perspective wasn't built on anger. It was built on experience, on moments that had revealed truth slowly, piece by piece, on encounters that had shown her both the possibility of connection and the reality of its limits. She didn't reject power entirely, but she no longer trusted it, and perhaps that was the most defining shift of all. Because in a world that depended on belief, her clarity set her apart. It made her someone who could see what others chose to ignore. Someone who understood that, behind every decision, every statement, every carefully constructed image, there was always something deeper. And that deeper truth wasn't always comfortable. But perhaps the most haunting question isn't what Diana thought of them. It's what might have happened if the world had heard her thoughts while she was still here. Some truths don't disappear, they wait. Hidden in whispers, memories, and fragments of conversations never meant to leave the room. And Diana's true thoughts on Britain's most powerful leaders may be one of those truths, still echoing, still unfinished, still capable of changing everything. What she understood didn't vanish with time. It didn't dissolve into the silence that followed her absence. If anything, it became more powerful, because it was never fully spoken. What remains is not a clear record, not a complete account, but something far more unsettling. Fragments, pieces of perspective scattered across moments, carried by memory, shaped by those who were close enough to hear, but never allowed to reveal everything. There are traces, small ones, subtle ones, a remark remembered, a reaction recalled, a shift in tone that hinted at deeper meaning. None of them complete on their own, but together they suggest something far greater than what was ever publicly acknowledged. And that is where the mystery deepens. Because the absence of clarity doesn't erase the truth, it protects it. It keeps it just out of reach, where it can't be confirmed, but also can't be dismissed. Diana's thoughts exist in that space now, not fully visible, but not gone, preserved in the quiet spaces between what was said and what was withheld. It raises a question that lingers long after everything else fades. How much did she truly understand? Because if the fragments we sense are only a fraction of what she knew, then the full picture may have been far more profound than anyone realized, and perhaps far more unsettling than the system itself was prepared to confront. That possibility carries weight, not just because of what it suggests about power, but because of what it reveals about silence, about how easily truth can be contained. Not by force, but by absence, by leaving things unfinished, by allowing time to blur the edges until certainty feels impossible. And yet, something remains. A feeling, a sense that there was more beneath the surface, that her perspective, formed through years of observation, shaped by moments few ever witnessed, held insights that never found their way into the open. Not because they lacked importance, but because they carried too much of it. That is what makes it endure. Not answers, but questions. Not clarity, but tension. Because when something is left incomplete, it continues to exist in possibility. And possibility, in a world built on control, can be more powerful than certainty. Diana's story doesn't close in a way that resolves itself. It lingers, it echoes, it leaves behind an awareness that what was seen, what was felt, what was understood, didn't simply disappear. It remains just beyond reach, shaping how we look back, how we interpret, how we question. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. that we may never fully know what she thought. But we can feel that it mattered. And perhaps, in the silence she left behind, the most powerful story of all is still waiting to be told.